welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on our second webinar in the TCLF Landslide in Action webinar series. My name is Sarah Kwan. I'm with Victor Stanley. As I mentioned, this is the second webinar in the Landslide in Action series. Today's webinar is titled Independent Small Equal Rights Protests. If you missed last week's webinar, you can find it under our On Demand section on our website under the Learning tab. I just want to quickly go over some housekeeping items before I hand it over to Charles. In order to receive the CEU for today, the 1.25 CEU credits, you must complete and pass the quiz. My colleague Andrew and I will be posting the quiz link throughout the webinar in the chat box. If you have any issues regarding the quiz or any technical difficulties, please send us a message in the chat box or an email at learning@victorstanley.com. Also, for any questions you have for the panelists, if you can please put them in the Q&A and not the chat. We just want to make sure we collect all your questions at the end for this panelists. Now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Charles and our guest speakers to begin the presentation.
Sarah, thank you. Beautiful day here in Washington, D.C. In fact, it would be a great day for a protest. And that's what we're here to talk about today, the notion of public protest and looking at these through multiple lenses. This is all part of the Cultural Landscape Foundation's demonstration grounds, which is the latest in our annual thematic report and digital exhibition at the foundation in our ongoing Landslide series. If you were with us for our first webinar last week, and a big shout out to Aileen Behringer, who also oversaw that for us, we are here to look at this notion of public protest and what those traces are in the landscape. This is the first time the program has not focused specifically on threatened landscapes or landscape features. Instead, Demonstration Grounds draws immediate attention to 13 sites across the country that have hosted significant protests. And it is at those protests that we're at risk of being forgotten or erased. In fact, today, government websites are being rewritten, altered, or disabled because the content does not reflect a preferred vision of our nation's history. Now, in November 2024, when we rolled out this report, it included 2 National Park Service units or sites, Independence Mall, the subject of today's webinar, and then also Alcatraz, which was the site of 3 years of red protests that took place there, which will be the subject of a later webinar. These were held up at that time at the foundation as models for telling our collective historic and cultural narrative in the fullest and broadest way possible. Today, many of the hot links in our report of just some months ago that link to NPS content have been severed. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, as Tiffany Hugh reported in the New York Times earlier this month, quote, segments of data sets are gone, some of the experts who produced them dismissed, and many mentions of words like Black, women, and discrimination have evaporated. Even the Enola Gay was stuck in this web gay net, if you will, as part of a broader DEI purge of content which had targeted over 26,000 images and online posts, which were all marked for deletion. That provides some context for today's discussion on how history is told or not told. New York City's Stonewall Inn is thought of as a birthplace of gay rights activism ever since a police raid took place there in 1969, touching off 3 days of protest that served as a force of political and social change. The nearly 8-acre national monument in the city's Greenwich Village neighborhood, which includes the bar, Christopher Park, which was rehabilitated by the late landscape architect Philip Winslow, who died of AIDS in 1989, which is just across the street, as well as several other nearby streets and sidewalks. It was established as a national monument under President Barack Obama in 2016. On February 12th of this year, the National Park Service edited the website text on the monument's main page, which until then had read, quote, before the 1960s, almost everything about living openly as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer LGBTQ plus person was illegal. That afternoon, the word transgender and the letter T in the abbreviation was removed. By the evening, the word queer and Q plus had been removed from the website. As TCLF noted in our 2020 Landslide report under the umbrella of race and space, erasure has served, quote, as a tool for establishing and advancing the dominance of one culture over another, and it has been a tactic of war, colonization, and oppression for most of human history, and it has supported American narrative for centuries. 4 years before Stonewall, gay and lesbians protesting discrimination held the first of 5 annual marches in front of Independence Hall on July 4th. The annual Reminder Days, as they were known, peaceful protests spurred the creation of annual Pride events across the country. Revisiting the memory-laden, century-spanning site today, Philadelphia-based photographer Sahar Costin Hardy was charged with conveying the integrity of setting for the site's protests and the cultural lifeways associated with the events that were intended to, quote, to serve as a reminder that homosexuals did not enjoy many of the rights that were protected in the Constitution. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the first annual Reminder Day and 56 years since Stonewall. Since those events, there have been extraordinary changes in law, society, and culture, including the legalization of same-sex marriage. Now, to unpack all of this, I'd like to set the stage for our speakers. Today's webinar participants have specifically been asked to address the significance of the 1960s protests in Philadelphia and New York, maintaining the history and memory of these events, and current challenges and threats both online and on-site. Their presentations will be followed by a respondent who was asked to convey the story through photography. Our first speaker, Andrew Dolkart, is a prolific author and a professor of historic preservation at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Andrew also serves as the project director of the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project. Andrew will be followed by Bob Skiba. Bob is a Philadelphia-based author and curator of the John J. Wilcox Jr. Archives at the William Way Gay LGBT Community Center, where he focuses on historical aspects of demonstrations, putting them in historic context, presenting how they came about, what they were, and what led to. Also based in Philadelphia is Max Dickson, who is a senior certified planner at OLIN Landscape Architects. Max also leads PrideScapes, an emergent research initiative through OLIN Labs, and explores the LGBTQ landscapes and people within the field of landscape architecture. And finally, Sahar Costin Hardy, who specializes in fine art and landscape architecture photography, whose work is focused on the intersections of race and cultural identity. She will unpack her process for photographing Independence. I encourage you to review Sahar's images of Independence Mall, as well as the entire website for Landslide 2024 demonstration grounds, which I'll post in the chat following these remarks. With that, we'll have Andrew get us started. Thank you all.
All right, thank you. As Charles has noted, we are in a period when attempts are being made to erase aspects of our history, especially aspects of American history that have actually not been acknowledged until relatively recently, and which some people would like to see disappear so that we can return to what they consider traditional American history. Fortunately, there are many of us who will not let this happen. I'm a founder and director of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, along with my colleagues Ken Lesbader and Jay Shockley and our project manager, Amanda Davis. And our aim is to make the often invisible history of queer people visible and known. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, we are a pioneering effort to identify and interpret extant sites of significance to LGBT history in New York City. Our main project is a website with almost 500 individual entries and more on the way. And we do walking tours, sponsor lectures and webinars, complete National Register nominations, and do all that we can to make LGBT site-based history known and accessible. If you're interested, check out our award-winning website, which we are very proud of. When dealing with LGBT demonstrations in New York, we need, of course, to start with Stonewall, the 1969 demonstration, often called a riot, that is generally seen as the beginning of the modern gay rights movement. I am going to assume that everyone knows a bit about what transpired when the police raided the Stonewall Inn on June 28, 1969, and the patrons fought back over 6 nights, so I won't go into that. By now, Stonewall has been widely recognized. With my colleagues, I completed the National Register nomination for Stonewall in 1999, the first site listed for its gay content, and it was later designated as a New York City landmark, became a National Historic Landmark, and in 2016, a national monument. The biggest challenge when completing the National Register listing was what should be recognized, since the events did not just play out at the bar, but in Christopher Park, which is what you see here, across the street and on adjoining streets where the demonstrators and the police chased each other. In order to draw the boundaries, which was a real puzzle how to do this, our colleague at the New York State Office of Historic Preservation suggested that we follow the guidelines for Civil War battlefields, and that's exactly what we did. And so here are the boundaries. And there where the asterisk is, that's the Stonewall Inn. This is Christopher Park. And these are the streets that we also included because this is where a lot of the action took place. And this is Sheridan Square and Washington Place, which we'll come back into the discussion a little bit later. Stonewall was not the first gay rights demonstration in New York. Historians have noted that the picketing in front of the U.S. Army building on Whitehall Street in Lower Manhattan on Saturday, September 19, 1964, attended by 10 men and women, was the first time gay and lesbian individuals had publicly demonstrated in the United States. The demonstration had little impact because it was small and on a weekend when the immediate area was largely empty. Another early demonstration was picketing at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza across from the United Nations in April 1965, protesting the treatment of homosexuals in the United States and Cuba, which followed a New York Times article about crackdowns in Cuba, which, according to a Cuban newspaper, would banish homosexuals from our virile nation, where the revolution is a movement of he-men. 29 people attended this demonstration. Many of the attendees became regulars at the Reminder Day demonstrations in Philadelphia that you will hear about in a few minutes. A parallel demonstration took place in front of the White House one day earlier. And one of the most interesting demonstrations straddled Stonewall in time and moves us out of Manhattan. A grove of trees at the edge of Flushing Meadow Park in the Kew Gardens neighborhood of Queens was a popular cruising spot. On June 18th to 20th, a group of local vigilantes with the tacit approval of the police chopped down the grove of trees at the edge of the park where gay men met. The vandals, who claimed to be protecting women and children, were never apprehended, but on July 1st, in the midst of the Stonewall riot, the New York Times had a front page article about the vigilante action. And here you can see the trees chopped down on the left and what the grove looks like today. A month later, somewhere between 50 and 100 members of the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, two early homophile groups, demonstrated at the site for several hours, attracting a large and curious crowd. Stonewall was not the first time that bar patrons had fought back when a bar was raided. There are several earlier examples, mostly on the West Coast, but Stonewall set off a revolution. It was the catalyst for the explosive growth of gay rights organizations in the United States and around the world, and for the demands for rights. As pioneering activist Frank Kameny noted in 1994, by the time of Stonewall, we had 50 to 60 gay groups in the country. A year later, there were at least 1,500. By 2 years later, to the extent that a count could be made, it was 2,500, and that was the impact of Stonewall. Within a month, the newly formed Gay Liberation Front organized a demonstration in Washington Square Park and a march to Christopher Park with a rally led by some of New York's most vocal activists. This is Marty Robinson speaking to the group, and we've identified a number of activists here in the crowd. This is Martha Shelley, for example, who was an early lesbian activist. And a few months later, Craig Wardwell and other New Yorkers, many of whom had attended the Reminder Day picketing in Philadelphia, decided that a more radical demonstration was necessary and began planning for the Christopher Street Liberation Day March to celebrate the first anniversary of Stonewall. And these are some of the organizers of that march. The marchers were to organize on Washington Place near Sheridan Square in Greenwich Village and would then proceed to Central Park. And this is Washington Place on the right. And this is Craig Rodwell's poster advertising the Liberation Day. They expected a few hundred people at most, but instead there were thousands. Historian Lillian Faderman has said that never in history had so many gay and lesbian people come together in one place and for a common endeavor. The march culminated in the first be-in in Central Park, and the event helped to solidify the significance of Stonewall. And of course, it led to annual gay pride marches in New York. This is the third gay pride march, and all over the world. This is London Pride, which I was lucky enough to be at last year. And even at Stonewall 50 in 2019, there was an alternate march which followed the route of the original march, because now the route goes south, and then the alternate march went north on the original route to Central Park. There have been many demonstrations in New York since the pioneering events, pre and post Stonewall. Demonstrations against homophile attacks and murders, such as that of gay bashing murder of Julio Rivera, which galvanized the Queens and Puerto Rican communities in support of political rights and to protest setbacks. This was a demonstration in favor of a gay rights bill at City Council, which ultimately failed in this year. Demonstrations relating to parades in which queer people were forbidden to march with signs, and leading to the St. Patrick's Day Parade for All in Queens. And here are South Asians demonstrating at an India Day parade where they were not allowed to march. Others brought attention to AIDS, including a series of demonstrations by ACT UP on Wall Street, focusing on pharmaceutical companies. The Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activists Alliance protested with what they called ZAPPs, one-off demonstrations to protest discrimination and put pressure on political figures, almost always combining serious protest with humor. And my colleague Jay Shockley has put all of these ZAPPs up on our website. My favorite ZAPP is the Lesbian Feminist Liberation ZAPP at the American Museum of Natural History in 1973, protesting sexist displays at the museum and the lack of professional women on the staff. Several hundred women demonstrated on the plaza in front of the museum with a 250-pound, 15-foot-long lavender-colored dinosaur, a Saphosaura named Dinah the Dicosaur. On these sites, only Stonewall is officially recognized and largely remembered. So how to commemorate these sites and allow their significance to be better known is a challenge. The Sites Project's website is one way to do this, and we have uncovered many protests and demonstrations that were largely forgotten. Since the start of our project, we have hoped that it would be a model for other cities and states. Certainly, more public recognition would be wonderful, perhaps painting the roadbed on Washington Place where the first march assembled. This happens to be in the Marais in Paris, but you get the idea. Or adding kiosks to the many kiosks already in Central Park to commemorate the park's gay history, both as a cruising site and the site of major demonstrations. Or I'm a huge fan of plaques, and I know you'll see the plaque on the left from Philadelphia in a little while. What is clear is that demonstrations have been a part of queer protest life in New York for decades, and in many cases, they have made a difference in the fight for our rights. So let's not forget this as attempts are made to push us back into the closet or take away our rights. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you for that rousing kickoff. Okay, moving right along. Bob, we're going to see if we have more luck with you showing your image. Oh, look at that. Excellent.
Isn't it nice when technology does what it's supposed to? So, Andrew, thank you for that. Philadelphia and New York have such close ties. It always has. And often we're overshadowed by what happened in New York. But now I'm going to talk about what happened before Stonewall in Philadelphia at Independence Park. I'm lucky enough to live only a few blocks from this site. A little background. Mid-century America was not the most welcoming place for queer people, for lesbians, gay men, especially for trans people. I think that queer issues were rarely talked about in mainstream media, and when they were, it was never complimentary. Queer people were looked at as, in the best light, as people to be pitied, and the worst light, as we see in the second image here, they were looked at as monsters who were going to destroy the fabric of American society. On top of that, we had 3 strikes against us. Sodomy was a crime in every state in the country in 1965, except for Illinois, which had modified their laws. Every major religion saw homosexuals as sinners, except, and this, I'm proud to be a Philadelphian to say this, were the Quakers here in Philadelphia. And lastly, In 1952, when the American Psychiatric Association published its first diagnostic manual, homosexuality was listed as a mental illness. So we were criminals, we were sinners, and we were mentally ill. Doctors took advantage of this. If we were mentally ill, they had the cure. I have friends. I came out in 1971. I had friends who had gone through electroshock therapy in the 60s and had lost parts of their life memories. People who were not subjected to electroshock were often subjected to lobotomies. And there were doctors who prescribed lobotomies as often as they prescribed aspirin. Horrific things that queer people had to go through. I would say if you stopped 100 Americans on the street in 1950 or so and asked them if they knew anyone who was queer, anyone who was gay or lesbian, or especially trans, they would have said, no, how could I? And this man, Alfred Kinsey, began to change that. In 1948, he published his book on sexuality in the American Male, and that kind of brought the words homosexual into common parlance. I love this cover of Time magazine. It doesn't say that Kinsey is talking about sex, but there are these little birds and bees on the cover. This man, starting in 1950, Joseph McCarthy, a senator, took advantage of this new public visibility of queerness, of homosexuality, and he used it as a cudgel to advance his own profession. What he did was, first of all, began a rant against communists in America. Secondly, which was called the Red Scare. Secondly, he slightly expanded that to include perverts working in the government and began what was called a lavender scare, saying that queers in the government were going to drag the government down. By 1953, President Eisenhower had signed an executive order saying that queer people could not work for the government because they were immoral, dishonest, and infamous, were the exact words that this order used. Just when it seemed like things were darkest in America, we had the beginnings of the gay rights movement. In California, we had the birth of the Mattachine Society, mostly for gay men, in 1950, with chapters in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. A few years later, as we heard this group mentioned before, was a women's group called the Daughters of Bilitis. Both these groups were not political. They were social support groups. And there's a huge difference in that both of them thought that 1960s America was not the place to start talking about gay rights. Some people began to question that. These are two local people that you absolutely need to know about. Barbara Giddings was a local lesbian activist who had helped found the Daughters of Bilitis in New York and lived here in Philadelphia. Frank Tammany had been the president of the Mattachine Society in Washington, D.C. So by 1960, 10 years after the first Mattachine Society, there were chapters here in Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C., which formed this little triad of activity. And some people like Frank and Barbara said, we can't just sit and talk around and talk about why am I gay? What do I need to do about it? We have to start fighting. What Frank Tammany said in 1964, which is as true today as it was then, is in America, no one hands you your rights on a silver platter. You have to fight like hell for them, and then you have to fight like hell to keep them. And they said, it's time to start acting. Here, New York, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia had formed an organization called ECHO, East Coast Homophile Organizations. They specifically use the word homophile, not homosexual. Why? Because homosexuality was the name for the disease, the mental illness the doctors used. So they were being proactive and came up with this new term, homophile. In 1963, they had their first meeting here, their first convention in Philadelphia. 1964, they met in Washington, D.C. 1965, they met in New York, and that's when they began to talk about political action. Early in 1965, they picketed the White House because of the policies not hiring queer people. That same year, they picketed the Pentagon because gays could not serve in the military. And finally, they picketed in New York at the UN protesting Fidel Castro's policies of incarcerating gay people. All these small individual protests were successful. They were so successful that this guy, Craig Rodwell, who was young at the time, in his very early 20s, Craig Rodwell was the founder of the Christopher Street, I'm sorry, the Oscar Wilde bookstore in New York, said, we have to find a wider audience. We have to do this on a bigger scale. What did he suggest? Independence Park in Philadelphia. It seemed like the perfect place. Why? Independence Hall was where our Declaration of Independence was written, and it's where our Constitution was drawn up. Perfect place to talk about rights in America. In 1965, Independence Hall had been the site of sit-ins protesting the segregation that was going on in the South and aiming to end that segregation. There were also anti-war protests around the same time at the same site and protests for women's rights as well. So again, it was marking Independence Hall as a place of public discourse. What they did was bus people in from New York, from DC into Philadelphia to begin what was going to become a series of annual protests. There were more people initially from New York and DC at the first one, which had about 44 people for a good reason. You took a huge risk being out in public and saying you were actually gay. There were fewer Philadelphians because they were on a home territory where people would recognize them. And these first of 5 annual reminders, as they were called, were very heteronormative. Women had to wear skirts or dresses. Men had to wear ties and jackets. This really left trans people or effeminate men, drag queens, or bull-like certainly out of the equation. And here they are marching in front of Independence Hall. These are Frank Kameni's rules for what you had to wear. Men had to wear ties and jackets. They had to be clean shaved. I would have been out of it. A lot of people rebelled against these laws. Frank's rationale was we can't look like those hippies across the street who are protesting the war. We are fighting for jobs. We need to look employable. Here's Frank in his tie and jacket, handing out leaflets to demonstrators. He's wearing a button that says spokesman because only Frank and a few other people were allowed to interact with the crowds. Frank said, you will carry the sign I give you, you will march in the order I tell you, and if you need to go to the restroom, I will have someone take your place and feed you back in when you show up. When you come back. We have in our archives here in Philadelphia many of these pamphlets that were handed out. Frank loved to write, and these pamphlets are like 6 pages long. They certainly were longer than tweets, and they were written in words and phrases that were taken from our Constitution, taken from our idea of our federal government. They compare discrimination against gay people to discrimination, to religious discrimination, and to racial discrimination. These are some of the signs that still remain. And he uses the term homosexual citizens over and over and over. I have to show you this brief clip. These movies were taken by Lily Vincennes, lesbian activist in Washington, D.C. This was done in 1968, and I just want to show you a little bit of it, if I can get this started. There it goes. Because nothing takes you back to the period like this little clip of a movie. So here it is, 4th of July, Philadelphia. There had been speeches and parades. But behind the balloons, there are gay people marching for gay rights. This is the last of those annual reminders, 1969. These two women are doing something totally outlandish. They are holding hands, and there is a woman in the back wearing pants. What had happened just a few weeks before? As we heard from Andrew, the Stonewall rebellions had happened, and the whole face of queer activism had changed forever. What happened? In December of 1969, all the organizations met, plus all these kids who were wearing bell-bottoms and tie-dyed shirts showed up, and they decided to end those annual reminders here in Philadelphia and decided to take it to New York next year with the Christopher Street Liberation Day. And you can see how what had been orderly marches. I was there. I was there at the first Christopher Street Liberation Day. And we can talk about that some other time. Here's Frank Tammany at that parade, lost the tie and jacket, but has his eyeside shirt all buttoned up. And here's Barbara Giddings, who's lost her little Marimekko sundress. The plaque went up in 2005. Here's Frank and Barbara in front of Independence Hall. I think they would have been amazed at what's happened since then. Barbara died of breast cancer in 2007. Frank died in 2011. I was really privileged to know both of them. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was illuminating, really. We realize how much we don't know as gay people about our own history. Thank you. Max?
Hi, everyone. Excited to be participating on this panel today and to continue the conversation. Okay. So since 2020, I have been leading a research and advocacy initiative called PrideScapes through OLIN's internal research group, OLIN Labs. Lab seeks to grow the impact of the landscape architecture profession through original research, thought leadership, and by building platforms for purpose-driven collaboration and activism. PrideScapes explores queer landscapes and seeks to clarify the crucial importance of preserving queer spaces, telling untold histories, and imagining new futures for historically and culturally significant queer landscapes. PrideScapes is also a platform to build community, form solidarities, and create visibility within the profession. We hope to create spaces for queer and trans landscape designers, architects, and planners to advocate, share work, and support one another. I just want to quickly start as we started talking about Independence hall and the surrounding landscape, I really went back to this day, August 15, 2019, which was my first day at OLIN. And while walking to work from my apartment, I decided to stop by this landscape, not really knowing anything about the history of it. And so I think this is just a really nice tie to kind of my personal history to this landscape, to the queer history of this landscape, and then to OLIN's work on this landscape, which I'll talk briefly about a little bit later. So we're in a time where we're really talking a lot about visibility and the erasure of queer history. And so as designers, we know that place and identity are so closely linked. Having physical echoes of queer identities in the landscape is really incredibly important to help queer and trans people connect with their own identity, reinforce a sense of belonging, and proudly acknowledge that queer and trans people have always existed in these spaces. As a community, the need for the preservation of our history, and in some cases, the reclaiming of this history and spaces, in particular, the history of the spaces queer folks claimed, created, and helped to flourish, is vital to educating younger generations on where we've been, what we've endured, and to help to continue to foster queer joy and resilience. And I just want to acknowledge the role of the national stages and iconic landscapes in this kind of visibility. And so here we're seeing the AIDS quilt on the National Mall. We are talking about Independence Hall and the surrounding landscape around it, but these national landscapes are really important to telling queer history and stories. As we've heard from Andrew and Bob, these two events, the annual Reminder Day demonstrations and Stonewall in 1969, really created a spark that rippled across the country. And so I would argue that now we have yearly demonstration pop-up grounds across the country in June through pride parades, pride festivals, and pride marches. And I just want to quickly remind everyone that pride is a protest. Pride has always been a protest. Around the world, queer people make themselves visible, often in dangerous climates, to stand up for their rights, their identities, and their very existence. Pride embodies both celebration and protest, and I think it's important to note that queer joy is an act of resistance. The Stonewall riots in 1969 were a spontaneous act of defiance against systemic oppression and really marked the beginning of the movement that would evolve into what we see today with pride events everywhere. These events continue to serve as powerful reminders of our ongoing struggle for equality, equity, and liberation, while also celebrating the joy and resilience of the queer community. And also, a lot of places are kind of moving away from calling these pride parades and really focusing them on calling them pride marches, which really brings it back to this act of protest. And also pride is visibility. It's about the importance of being seen and taking up space and often reclaiming the space that has been taken from us. Here is highlighting the Tenderloin neighborhood and the Compton's Transgender Cultural District. In 2017, this area became the first ever transgender cultural district in the world. And really this mural is creating the visible mark in the landscape for Black trans lives. Outdoor public spaces have really historically been tied to the queer community and have been important places for community gathering, cruising and sex, mobilization, and celebration. These locations, which include parks and plazas, beaches and waterfronts, are where the queer community have appropriate spaces for survival and existence, as well as for queer activism. Early queer spaces were behind closed doors, where darkness and seclusion offered possibilities for remaking both the spaces between and the bodies themselves, like discos and nightclubs, bathhouses, or abandoned buildings and piers. Activist movements, however, were the decisive breakout moments and the spilling out of queerness into public spaces. Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, queer folks increasingly occupied in queer public space and public imaginations, raising awareness and visibility through gay pride marches. So as streets and alleys become crucial queer spaces through demonstrations, I really want to focus on the Pride March routes. And I think it's really important just to kind of anchor these routes between important queer spaces and iconic landscapes. For the first New York City Pride route, the important queer space was Greenwich Village, and they went to the iconic landscape of Central Park. In Philadelphia, the important queer space was Rittenhouse Square, which in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was really the central gathering space for queer individuals in Philadelphia. And they, of course, marched to the iconic landscape of Independence Mall. So this is a quick map of kind of the general location of Rittenhouse Square to Independence Mall. The route started down Chestnut Street and ended at Independence Park. As America's birthplace, Philadelphia is home to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And it really only seems appropriate that the first march would go to that location. And as Bob and Andrew have talked about, the importance of that location within the political climate that was happening at this time. In the 1970s, Philadelphia opened its first gay community center near 3rd and South Street. This building would later become the William Way Community Center, and the move to 13th and Spruce really pulled Philadelphia's queer community across Broad Street towards Locust and 13th Streets, and this became what is today known as the Gayborhood. So the important queer space today is the Gayborhood, and still the march begins at Independence Mall. And so again, you can see the move across Broad Street to the Gayborhood, and today the march starts at Washington Square, which is just south of Independence Mall, and marches to the Gayborhood. You can see what this looks like every single summer and the first weekend in June. And I think it's also important, we've been talking about Philadelphia and New York, but just to really acknowledge that these queer spaces, queer resistance, queer protests popped up all over the country. And so I just want to highlight a city in the Midwest that follows kind of a similar pattern, and this is Minneapolis. So the important queer space here is Loring Park. In Minneapolis, Loring Park became a gathering space for members of the queer community, and in particular, gay men for cruising, since the layout of the park made car cruising possible. While it was a hub for the queer community, it also became a place of queer violence and trauma. It wasn't unusual to open the paper at the time and see that someone had been beaten or murdered in Loring Park. In 1973, Loring Park was chosen as the location for Pride in direct response to the violence against queer people in the park. A group of people waited in the park while another group marched down Nicollet Mall in case people were arrested. Pride is still held in Loring Park every year, and this image is showing the march going down Nicollet Mall, which is a really iconic landscape within Minneapolis. So I just want to wrap up by talking about how to continue to maintain queer history and visibility in the current climate. I think we'll hear in the discussion many ways that people are doing it, but one way is to design space for demonstration. So great public spaces are really spaces where people can gather spontaneously, exchange ideas. But what the Independence National Historical Park, which was redesigned by OLIN, it really put the First Amendment Plaza, which is seen here, in direct conversation with Independence Hall. And so by very intentionally and explicitly designing a space for demonstration, it's creating a space for people to gather within this really important landscape, not only within Philadelphia, but within the country, and creating space for people to come together and share ideas on varying ends of our political, cultural spectrum. We can also continue to show up and claim these queer spaces. So here's the 50th anniversary celebration, which took place in front of Independence Hall. This was a recreation of those early demonstrations and marches. And it really became an explosion of queerness on the National Independence National Historical Park, which was really great to see, people taking up this space and really re-queering it. We can do it through murals, signage, and interpretive elements. So this is a mural in Philadelphia by illustrator Kai Yangi, which created this space called We Are Universal, in collaboration with the residents of the city's Morris Home, which is the only residential recovery center in the country specifically serving trans people. We can do it through collective mapping. So this is the Philadelphia LGBT Mapping Project, which maps queer spaces all throughout the city. This is a pop-up by the Philadelphia Lesbian Mapping Project, which is showing at various locations different events that happen. So again, really spontaneously and popping up queer history within our public spaces. And we really need to continue place-based history research. So this was a queer history walk in Philadelphia that Bob and I led a few years ago for the American Planning Association. And so this has really been something that both the American Planning Association and the American Society of Landscape Architects have been trying to do at various conferences. So in addition to Philadelphia, we've done walking tours in San Francisco, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Denver. So really going into these places and being intentional about calling out queer history. This is from the Washington, D.C., and so you can see the number of people that came out, and this was led by David Rubin and Land Collective. And we really need to leverage online resources. So LGBTQ America was a great edited volume that came out in 2016 by the National Park Service about queer history all throughout the country. Unfortunately, it has been taken down from the National Park Service website, and it now lives here in Out History, where you can still access the full document. So I would encourage people to come here and to access this resource. But we're really kind of leveraging online resources that may have been taken down. I think we've been experiencing this in all aspects of landscape architecture profession, of different resources being taken down, but it's particularly impactful within the queer community. So I'll stop there and pass it off to Sahar.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and to Charles and TCLF for inviting me to share a little bit about my work. This history is so incredible and so important. Thank you guys so much for sharing this. I feel so full right now. I'm going to try to make my presentation a little bit quicker because I know that we're running out of time. But I just want to talk a little bit about photographing the space. So I'm Sahar Costin Hardy, and I concentrate on photographing the built environment and people. And TCLF asked me to photograph this space for demonstration grounds, and it was certainly an interesting challenge. When you're tasked with visually representing physical spaces that harken to past events or even landmarks that once were, it's difficult. And as a native Philadelphian, I didn't know this history. And it's a shame because this history, as Bob mentioned, is completely, readily available, especially on the historical markers. It is definitely difficult though when you're from a place. These historical markers tend to blend in to the fabric of the city, and you feel like the history already, but we really need to stop and re-educate ourselves. So the TCLF provided me with some background information, and you've seen this slide already, but some information on the protest, the annual reminder day in 1965 that predated Stonewall. So I am no stranger to documenting protests, and I even started my passion for photography in high school, documenting protests. So this is from the 90s, late 90s, documenting Kensington Welfare Rights Union that is different organization now, but I photographed many protests, throughout my life and career. Many protests that I attended throughout the Black Lives Matter movement, this over a decade now, in 2014 and beyond. In more recent years, photographing the first weekend of the Black Lives Matter Plaza. Rest in peace to that plaza. That is no longer due to this administration. And of course, photographing protests to the defiance of Trump's first administration in Philadelphia. But without an active protest, how do we really show this landscape of resistance? So we had a conversation a bit before this panel started, and really I have to just reiterate that my approach was mostly within. So really shifting my perspective and like learning as much as I can and could about the protests, and diving into the materials that the TCLF provided me with, and just kind of, changing my perspective and focusing on, the events that were here previously, but while I am photographing, all of the elements of the space at the time. So really attempting to like hold the weight of these past protests while I'm currently photographing. I have a personal project that I'm working on with a co-creator of mine, Jennifer Root, investigating spaces that were listed in the Green Book, which are the Black travel guides to help people move safely through the South during Jim Crow. And so I was thinking about that project as well, because that project really looks at some of the physical structures that have been razed, abandoned or converted. So some of those elements and those structural elements still exist throughout what were listed in the Green Book, but some are completely gone, of course, due to structural systemic racism. So my approach was similar. I was thinking about how I approached, and it's a continuing project, how I'm approaching that project, but like how I'm really able to, and how as photographers we're able to tell a story that harkens to the past, but through current photography. So it was incredibly inspiring to learn about the fight for LGBTQ plus rights here, right on Chestnut Street at INHP. And I revisited that footage that Bob started to show, pausing quite often to try to get my bearings. Of course, the site has been redesigned and changed quite a bit, but really trying to like understand with fresh eyes, how all of the elements relate to each other. And I approached this assignment much like many editorial assignments, which is very different from how I would typically photograph a space for landscape architects. These two images were photographed for OLIN. And so when I'm photographing for designers, it's really about following the engagement that's happening in the site, and looking for these beautiful, sweet moments that really just show how this space helps people to feel at one and in community, and highlight, the joy and the activity that's happening there. So for editorial projects, it's the same type of emphasis, perhaps, on people activating the space, but less of a focus on bringing that specific feeling of excitement or joy to the forefront, and more about real true documentation. And of course, adhering to journalistic standards. We're not removing anything in post, we're not editing anything out of the image. I was also provided by the TCLF with very specific parameters and a loose shot list. So I was, of course, able to use my own creative interpretation, but it was nice to be able to follow these parameters. So I was photographing the change in paving. That was really important as a through line from the 1960s events to now. Also the arcades, and really challenging myself to photograph them in different ways, so that, there are multiple choices and selections that you can have in order to tell this story, and incorporating context and then zooming in, all of these techniques that of course photographers are consistently using. I visited during different times of day, making sure that I was highlighting the historical markers in the right time of day for the light, and that was different there's 2 historical markers on the site, or maybe more than that, but I photographed 2, and so those were definitely during different times of day. But also, photographing the markers as standalone pieces, but also, incorporating the context was very, very much key to this project and photographing for demonstration grounds. The Washington statue, of course. But I think my favorite challenge for this project was photographing the trees. So Charles mentioned trees as witness earlier, and in the brief that they gave me, they mentioned architecture as witness as well. And these are just such beautiful pieces of our history, I've been thinking about how trees are represented in my practice right now as well, and I've been playing with different approaches. I photographed for the Garden as Art publication edited by Thaisa Way for the centennial of Dumbarton Oaks, and there we playfully decided to photograph tree portraits for the garden and for the publication. And so I've actually been trying to weave that kind of concept into much of my work since, and did the same here. Just, trying multiple angles, mostly incorporating the context, of course, so that you understand where you are in the site, but really trying to hone in on making the tree the hero of the frame. I also did my best to highlight the character of the space with the visitors and the residents passing through, so that you could really understand what it's like to be on Chestnut Street at INHP. And now every time I'm in this space, I'll be thinking about the strength of the LGBTQ plus community and how important and meaningful protest is, in our culture and to our future, period. And with that, just thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to join the conversation.
Sahar, Sahar, please everyone, make yourself visible and join the group for this dialogue. I want to thank all of our speakers. Wow. I'm so moved by the presentations today. It has sort of thrown me a little off kilter, actually. And Sahar, I just have to say to you, I've seen your work for so many years, and it's really wonderful to get a greater sense of how you approach your subjects, living and non-living. So I want to open the floor here for discussion. We tackled this notion of public protest this year really for 2 reasons. The first, I think we've all touched upon in terms of where we are politically right now. But the other aspect of this was specifically in our work in landscapes that have undergone purposeful erasure, where the notion of the history that took place was not present. It's not included in the period of significance in National Register nominations. If it's an NGO, perhaps, they may not include that in their mission and vision statements. There may be an absence of online or on-site interpretation, and we've seen a lot of creative examples of that today. I think, this is a group that has embraced the plaque in many ways. They don't view this as plaque decay, as a colleague of mine likes to say, when things get overplaqued, perhaps. But what I want the group to speak to is, number one, many of these places are iconic. Just as an example, Max spoke about Loring Greenway and, Loring Park and the Nicollet Mall. And there are other spaces that we've touched upon today where these events have taken place in some cases for decades, and yet they're outside of the recognition by the National Register because of when those nominations were drafted. And so I was curious if the group would speak to this notion of the visibility and value, and what we can do as landscape architects, as historians, as photographers, as curators to raise the notion of a greater and more holistic context in terms of the story of place, and specifically through this lens here of protest in LGBTQ sites.
Well, I can jump in on that. I think that historically, National Register nominations, unless they were for a landscape like Central Park, have ignored landscape in large part. And maybe I hope that's changing. But one thing that we've been doing is amending National Register nominations and doing overlays on historic districts. So we just did an overlay for the Greenwich Village Historic District for queer life. And we've included the places of protest that are within the boundaries. So where the first Liberation Day parade met on Washington Place is now mentioned in our overlay. So I think that that's something that activists can do, because the National Park Service is very open to these kinds of amendments and overlays.
Super. I want to just say that this question is also echoed in the chat by Renee Ares. What are the ways other than plaques to raise the visibility of queer history in the landscape? Andrew, I guess as a follow-up, Sahar, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna, sorry to do this to you, Max, but just kind of push Max to the forefront only because I am very inspired by his PrideScapes project, and I just want him to talk a little bit more about that. And I think that he's really, the PrideScapes is really helping to move that forward.
Yeah, thank you, Sahar. But no, I think this question that Renee put in the Q&A is a good question of, like, other than plaques or historic nominations and designations, which are all really great and useful and I think are needed, but sometimes, you know, queer history is largely invisible. So what are ways that we can really bring it out and make it visible in the landscape? And so I think thinking about, you know, instead of plaques, are there other interpretive signage, or are there other kind of installations or murals that can be placed into the landscape? Is there programming that can happen? Is there, you know, we talk about rainbow flags, but sometimes that's an overused thing, but really that is a really clear way of kind of bringing visibility. And so the rainbow flag, the rainbow sidewalk are kind of, you know, cliche things, but I think that they really are sometimes important to kind of really mark it as a visible queer space. In Philadelphia, on our street signs in the neighborhood, we have the Pride flag underneath them, kind of marking the designation areas of the neighborhood. And so that's a visual thing. But I really think it's about just, you know, just thinking of other creative ways. It can be through design, it can be through art, but I think that there are a lot of ways that we can start to tap into, you know, bringing out this visible queerness into these spaces.
Thanks, Max. I would echo that and definitely say public art as well. I wrote down the LGBTQ plus mapping projects that you showed earlier, and just so that I can go back and like look around the city for them, because that looked incredible to me. And I think these potentially these smaller interventions where people are just going about their day, walking around and learning this history is, you know, is really meaningful, even if it seems like if it's a smaller, you know, intervention or like public piece, it's still very meaningful and helpful for the larger community.
Totally, like the Philadelphia Lesbian Mapping Project, those posters that were just up on those street poles, I think were like amazing to see as you're walking around. Some of them were really kind of lighthearted, others were more serious, but they were just like kind of just quick visual things as you're walking on the sidewalk of like, oh, interesting. And then like really tying it back to, you know, the neighborhood in Philadelphia, but it really could tie you back to any place wherever they're happening across the country. So yeah, I think it's really important to have, you know, it doesn't need to be big, it can be small, but I think it's important to have those kind of visible signs within our landscape.
You know, when we convened last week, Dina Tasswinter from Village Preservation spoke to the oral history work that they've been doing there, specifically in relationship to the protests against Robert Moses when a road was going to go through Washington Square Park. I'm wondering from any of the speakers in Philadelphia or New York if there's been similar oral histories done with people who were protesters and who were part of the movement in different cities.
Well, we haven't done formal oral histories, but we've been having webinars like this with protesters, who we record them and then we put them up on our site. So so Ellen Brody and others have been interviewed about the protests, and they're available to the public.
Charles, we do have an oral history project here in Philadelphia through our archives, and that's been an ongoing thing for years. And I think that fits into a little bit about what Max talked about, that queer spaces are not only the big spaces where the news was made, but it's where people live their lives every day. And that's why that lesbian mapping project, I think, is so much fun, is that queer people took spaces that were not easily accessible and made them their own.
Super. A very specific question for Andrew, because this is something that came out in our earlier webinar that I didn't really know anything about in terms of the challenges of documenting the territory, if you will, for the district in terms of the route of the protests associated with Stonewall. And Andrew, you mentioned about using, going to this, I believe it was the Civil War battlefield program in terms of mapping troop movements and how that was helpful as a precedent for you with the National Park Service.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was amazing because whoever thought that that's what would be our model, and what those guidelines basically in a nutshell said was, you can list the sites of action, but not the sites where people gathered before or after, unless they were of specific. They were the specific reason for the site. So that's what we did. We didn't do the ancillary spaces where people came from or exited to, but we looked at where the battlefield, so to speak, was located, and it was a brilliant solution, and it also had the added importance that to be listed on the National Register, you need owner consent, and at that time, the owner of Stonewall was totally opposed to it, but by adding the streets and the park, the city was the other owner. And the city was in favor. And when it was 1-to-1, it got listed.
I guess the other question maybe that I want to ask those that are involved in projects with a nonprofit umbrella, what can people do now to support these efforts during these times when, the sort of erasure that we've spoken about? Where is the help needed in terms of raising the visibility as well as resource protection?
Well, I certainly have to put a little pitch in here for queer archives and libraries, because that's a obvious place to start to support the research and the work of queer historians who are documenting all this, who are making sure that all voices are amplified and talked about, because they have the power to do that. So that's a good place to start. I'm happy to say that here in Philadelphia, we have a preservation alliance, and they've decided to do this summer's issue on preserving queer spaces. So that's certainly one step in the right direction. But I think as historians, those of us who feel like we have to do twice as much work now and do it twice as well.
I do think that there's a huge amount of interest in America, not just in New York and Philadelphia and Washington, but all over in these issues. I was over election day, I was in St. Louis, and the Missouri Historical Society had a huge queer St. Louis show. It was a major exhibit. So I think that this is out there, and that we just keep on having to do things publicly, giving walking tours, speaking, doing all kinds of things because the public is interested. So just because the federal government wants to crack down doesn't mean that we have to let them do that.
And I would also say that students are interested. There have been so many students who are really interested in exploring queer spaces, queer history. And so I think that, people are interested in this and they're going to do this work. And so I think it's just within the landscape architecture profession, historic preservation, planning professions, to really kind of help foster and create spaces where students, emerging professionals can do this work and really start to advance it. And then it's going to trickle up into all of our firms and the work that we're doing. So I think that's also really important as a way of continuing this research, this work, and this visibility.
Max, let me just ask I'm sorry, please, Sahar. You're muted.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just piggybacking off of Max, that also invite your artist collaborators too. And definitely as photographers and writers, artists, we need to make this kind of work and we need to continuously document because, if you're photographing and we have like a record of, what is happening, what was there, that's extremely important, especially when we're talking about archiving.
Agreed. Max, just as a follow-up question for you, I became aware of the work of OLIN through your work at PrideScapes, and as sort of one of the leading practices in the field. This for me is when this was unveiled, it was pretty pioneering within the discipline of landscape architecture. And really hats off to everyone at OLIN. And I guess the question I want to ask, because now you've been doing this for a number of years, is how have you seen this impact the way the broader practice works, your colleagues in landscape architecture as well, and maybe think about how it might translate to the greater profession of other firms that might consider broadening the lens here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just by starting this and getting the conversation going, you start to realize how many other firms or individuals within those firms are interested in this work and are supportive of it and want to do it as well. And so I think just kind of by starting this and getting kind of people to know about it, kind of open the door of other people to start popping up at other firms, being like, we want to get involved. We also want to do this. And, it's not only within firms, but it's also within the American Society of Landscape Architects at the national level, as well as within state chapters, that people are really interested in either hosting happy hours or doing webinars or just creating a larger network. And so I think that people have been interested in this and they just have kind of needed kind of the opportunity to be like, oh, there's something that exists. How can I plug in? How can I get involved with it? And so at the American Society of Landscape Architecture, we have the Pride X ASLA chapter, which is active on Instagram, and they are doing events within the larger ASLA community. Planning has the APA Planning LGBTQ division, and so they're active in doing stuff. So I think that there's opportunities for people to plug into these larger groups and networks and start getting involved, both at the upper levels, but also within firms, and hosting happy hour for Pride is an easy way to get your firm kind of like started on talking about some of these issues.
Super. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of the panelists for today. I'm just so excited and elated by this feeling right now as we've watched so many other things take place in terms of erasure. Max, thank you also for the heads up about our history. I know for many of us, it's nice to know that that is still available online. It was a critical study. And just thank you, everyone. A big round of virtual applause and emojis and hearts. So stay tuned to our calendar for the next series. We have 6 more of these that we're rolling out, and we'll also be posting all of these webinars online. Again, thank you to our partner at Victor Stanley, and more to come. Thank you all.